Queridos, bom dia, boa tarde, boa noite, boa madrugada para os corredores. Hoje a gente vai, mais uma vez, fazer um episódio internacional. Você que está escutando já sabe que, se quiser ver com legenda, está disponível no YouTube. Já aproveita aí, já deixa o like, que foi sempre um trabalho assim, de 8, 9 horas para conseguir legendar tudo, mesmo com a ajuda da inteligência artificial. Então já deixa o like aqui no YouTube, já compartilha com os amigos, já se inscreve no canal. Se você estiver escutando no Spotify, já dá 5 estrelinhas, no Apple Podcasts também. Sempre ajuda a gente a alcançar mais gente. Hoje eu recebo um ex-juiz do Tribunal Constitucional, do Tribunal Europeu, da Corte Europeia de Direitos Humanos, e atual professor da Central European University, professor András Sájo. Eu acho que eu acertei o nome dele. O professor escreveu um livro com a capa maravilhosa. Se a gente fosse traduzir, se chama Governando pela Trapaça. É a governança nos regimes iliberais, ruling by cheating. E aí a gente conversou um pouco sobre como não só os regimes iliberais eles se estabelecem, como os governantes liberais eles sabotam as regras do jogo e eles continuam utilizando mecanismos que são legítimos para eventualmente modificar as regras do jogo e se entrincheirar no poder. O professor traz algumas diferenciações conceituais, ele defende que esses regimes liberais eles estão nas famílias das democracias e não das famílias das autocracias em regimes puramente autoritários. Então tem algumas questões de teoria constitucional muito importantes aqui também. O episódio ficou muito rico do ponto de vista teórico, ele traz muitos insights do ponto de vista prático também, e, obviamente, tenho que lembrá-los que este podcast se sustenta com a ajuda de vocês. Então, se o Onze faz parte da vida de vocês, eu sei que sempre os episódios em estrangeiros são mais difíceis, a audiência não é tão alta, mas eu estou sempre trazendo aqui o máximo de conteúdo que eu posso, que seria geralmente inacessível para as pessoas que não tivessem acesso aos livros ou a esses professores. Então, se você pode ajudar a gente, se o Onze faz parte da sua vida, se o Onze te enriquece intelectualmente, dá uma conferida no nosso Apoia-se. Tem lá na descrição na descrição aqui do episódio, tá? O link para o nosso Apoia-se. Você tem acesso antecipado aos episódios. Você pode receber livros, pode receber livros da nossa curadoria, e, enfim, tem um monte de benefícios. E também você pode optar por mandar um Pix recorrente aí, o link, a chave do nosso Pix recorrente também está na descrição do episódio. Não esquece de mandar só o teu contato lá na mensagem do Pix para eu poder adicionar o teu número lá ao nosso grupo do Telegram. E claro, tenho que lembrar da minha querida Contracorrente Editora, editora do meu coração, uma das editoras que está fazendo um trabalho mais fantástico no mercado editorial do Brasil ultimamente, publicando aí, como diria meus amigos, só pedrada. E tem também, claro, cupom de desconto do Onze Supremos. Um 25% de desconto em todo o catálogo da Contra e ainda reverte em comissão para a gente. Então, maravilha, todo mundo se ajudando. E claro, também lembrar do meu querido Felipe Augusto, lá comandante do Ouse Saber Cursos Preparatórios, que já aprovou mais de 4.000 pessoas aí nas grandes carreiras de magistratura, Ministério Público, Defensoria, Procuradorias e Delegados de Polícia. Se você está querendo encurtar a sua carreira até a aprovação, o Onze com certeza tem materiais ali, cursos de excelência para você chegar até lá. E também ainda tem o cupom de desconto aqui na descrição do episódio também, para você acessar todos os cursos do Ouse Saber, com desconto provido pela gente, e dessa vez sem nenhum tipo de comissão. Vai lá. É isso, pessoal. Eu espero que vocês gostem do episódio de hoje. Meu nome é Davi Sobreira, e esse é o nosso Supremos podcast do Ulisses Centro de Estudos Constitucionais. Dear friends, I have the honor today to welcome Professor. Professor, please correct me in the pronunciation. It's András Sájo?
András Sájo.
András Sájo, okay.
Very good.
Professor András Sájo. And we're going to talk about one of his books that has a beautiful cover, Ruling by Cheating. Professor has worked in the European Court of Human Rights and today is a professor at the Central European University. And we're going to talk about democratic backsliding and governance in illiberal democracies. So, Professor, let me start with one very important and conceptual question. there are some scholars that are not comfortable or contest the idea that we can use the expression illiberal constitutionalism, such as Professor Gabo Haumai, for example. Right in the beginning of your book, you explain that this oxymoron it's not problematic at all. Can you please begin explaining why don't you think this expression is wrong for academic literature?
So look, I'm not sure that the incredible energy spent on definitions and categorization is very helpful as long as the symptoms are understood in a similar way. Now, what words to use? I think that illiberal democracy as an expression has the merit that it was used by the person who was able to turn this into a self-perpetuating regime, namely the Hungarian prime minister. He called his system illiberal democracy. As to the merit, again, I think that it is illiberal, so in that respect, there is not much debate. The debate is whether something that is illiberal can be democratic. And of course, if you look at history, it can be. So starting with ancient Athens, it was not liberal, but it was a democracy. And secondly, I think that those who are concerned about the term illiberal applied to democracy consider democracy as an ideal. And I think that's a very legitimate approach. But this somehow creates a misunderstanding because the unconditional veneration of democracy is one of the sources of one of the reasons why it is so malleable. Democracy can be, and it was historically quite often, just primarily a plebiscitarian regime. In political sociology, Max Weber already considered similar regimes as plebiscitarian leader democracies. So there are many ways to approach it, but the bottom line is that those who believe that there is no such thing as illiberal as a form of democracy forget that democracy has many forms, and to assume that it exists only in its ideal form, that is mistaken. It somehow it makes us vulnerable because we attribute all good things to democracy and we don't see that it can be a degenerate form of government, as it was already clearly stated by Aristotle. So that's why I think terminology and the debates on terminology are a little bit misleading and are due to certain attributions that are not always well placed. So that's why I use it. I think it's a sustainable expression. I can't hear you.
Sorry, taking a ride on what you said about Max Weber. There's a concept of his in his studies about charismatic authority. In your book, you talk about you develop a concept of plebiscitary leader democracy. How does these two concepts relate in today's regimes?
So if you look at this kind of democracy, which in another book of mine, which I hope will appear at the end of the year, I call this kind of democracy mimetic. So it's a mimetic democracy, so democracy by imitation, but mimesis is richer than simple imitation. And that's what we are facing. The leader exercise, it's really followed as if he were the leader of a cult, but he is reflecting really the values, aspirations, ideas of his followers. So it's a reciprocal relationship. And that is what takes the whole thing into some kind of plebiscitarianism, where plebiscitarianism, a plebiscitarian form of democracy, means that the leader sets the agenda, reflecting already what his select people would like to see, and then time and again he is reinforced. It is not necessarily in the form of traditional plebiscite. Traditional plebiscite is where the leader determines the topic or the issue, and the people are called to vote on it, and the vote to either or, and the vote is always a matter of expressing confidence. So this is a traditional understanding. But the way plebiscitarian democracies work, that every ordinary election is the expression of the confirmation of the position of the leader. So that's what we are facing today. So whether this is done within relatively fair elections or not very fair elections, that's a different story. What matters is the outcome. The leader can tell his followers that you really like me, you really like what I stand for. And that's really what turns this into a plebiscitarian system. And that's true from Chavez to Putin to Erdogan to Orban.
Professor, another important matter you talk about in your book is that you say that illiberal democracies are not merely authoritarian regimes in disguise. In your opinion, in your reading, what are the key normative and institutional distinctions that justify treating these illiberal democracies as within a separate category of a democracy and not mere autocracies?
Right. So I think it makes a little, it helps us a little bit to distinguish between autocracy, authoritarianism, and illiberal democracy. And I would like to emphasize that this is a continuum, and there's a very clear trend that illiberal democracies are just a stage, and because of internal dynamics and many other things, international relations, they shift gradually towards autocracy, and the autocracy can be different, can be, theocratic. It matters really that a single person or a small clique determines whatever they like will be carried out. It can be authoritarian in the sense that the fact that someone controls society and the state becomes an authority, and his commands are followed just for the reason that it comes from the ruler. So he is the authority. It can be a divine authority, can be a charismatic authority, can be a legal authority. Science is also an authority. And, you accept what the physician tells you because he is an authority for you. So you follow it, not because you understand what he is saying, not because you would like to check it, just because you have no choice. It comes from him. So this is the authoritarian or authority-based element. That's authoritarian. It's not necessarily autocratic, right? So I think once we make these distinctions, and once we recognize that illiberal democracies move towards autocracy and very often rely on authoritarian exercise of power, we have a clearer picture what we are talking about. So that's what I think is the importance of being also an authoritarian regime. It's not illiberal democracies as such are not necessarily authoritarian. They do allow or various forms of divergences as long as they do not endanger the power. If once they are autocracies, of course, there is only one line of command, one line of ideas. That's the ruler's desire. So that these are the conceptual differences.
Professor, Anne Applebaum, the famous journalist, wrote a book recently, Autocracy Inc., in which she argues that the rise of authoritarian regimes have been allowed and sometimes fostered, although indirectly, by a blind eye from democratic regimes that allows them to thrive in the democratic world while doing these shady deals to hide wealth and do authoritarian practices. From a theoretical perspective, what do you think are the major blind spots that have allowed these illiberal regimes to rise in the modern days?
So obviously, with all due respect to Madame Applebaum, this is a very old idea, pretty well known. Time and again, people has written why she made her name on this has to do with things unrelated to academic cognizance. Now, what we have seen since the collapse of dictatorships in Latin America, let me backtrack. So consider Guatemala and the US in 1952, or Honduras and the United States at that time. It's a Cold War, and you are either afraid of communists who are actually infiltrating, no question about that, or you are interested in becoming rich with the support of the United States, or you want to have your own dictatorship and you don't have enough resources, and then you rely again on some international actors. And that's what keeps your regime, your dictatorship
working, alive.
Sustainable. So this is something that was always in the nature of the world. Democracies forget about contemporary events. Dictatorships always existed because of international conflicts. One more example. So I was talking about the early 50s. I should have mentioned, because this is the real point of departure, Athens and Rome. So the Athenian democracy, in order to be sustainable, became imperialistic. They stole all the wealth and treasure of the common of the federation. That made for many years Athens prosperous. Then the whole system ended up in conflict and collapsed. But so democracy was sustainable because of some kind of imperialistic theft. That's Athens. You look at Rome. In order to sustain the Roman Republic and to make the Republic peaceful, in order to keep the population of Rome at bay, they had to conquer, and have the grain for free to be distributed basically from the late 2nd century before Christ, before our era. So this think that a republic, a democracy exists is not something isolated, not something constrained, limited. It never exists in isolation. So today, after the collapse of communism and the dictatorships a little bit earlier in Latin America, these countries were had difficulties of being sustained, and the internet, the what is called globalization, so the increased interdependence among states also gave opportunities for the so-called more established, certainly more influential, more powerful states, which were democracies, to intervene. In a good sense, it was mutually advantageous, but this mutual advantage resulted in some kind of how to put it, in some kind of benevolence, mutual benevolence. So that no one wanted to see that things are going in the wrong direction. A little bit is like colonialism in the 19th century. People didn't realize what kind of negative effects it will have on the metropole, on the colonizer. Not only morally, but on the longer run, sure, they became rich, but the economy is hardly sustainable. Look at Belgium, for example. It's still living on some of the remnants of the glory. UK. So this kind of dependence creates a system where you don't really get involved. People prefer to analyze this at the level of the European Union or dependence from the United States, but I think this is a much broader thing, much broader, much more common, and it's a matter of dependency which creates blind spots because of interests. So the interests dictated no interference, and benevolence. So everybody it was of the view, forget about the end of history, but everybody was of the view that basically there is only one game in town, democracy. So everyone will move towards democracy. And well, there are mistakes or difficulties, but these are just inevitable on the learning curve. If you look at Journal of Democracy, it took those very famous scholars who run Journal of Democracy 10 years to realize that things are not going according to their prediction. In the case of Hungary, already, forget about what happened before the second coming to power of Orbán. In 2010, Hungarians were quite, the then opposition was quite aware that things are going in the wrong direction. After 6 months with the institutional changes, it was clear that this is not going to end well. No one wanted to listen, not just because the German industry in Hungary was interested in sustaining the system because it provided them all sorts of advantages and subsidies and cheap labor, but also because this divergence did not fit into the democratic playbook. So interest and blindsidedness following a belief in the glorious victory of democracy created a short-sightedness. And that's still very much the case, not anymore short-sightedness, but because of dependence, either because you don't want to have your system, your network of states being weakened, or because of direct economic interest, or internal support for what goes on in illiberal democracies. This is not still not a subject matter of intervention. A very last remark: the international legal order does not allow genuine tools and genuine normative grounds for intervention into these matters. Sovereignty is king. Not that it's really as powerful as it is claimed, but it is something that would require a rethinking, a readjustment of international law. And that is very unlikely.
Professor, in another point, you discuss, and this I think we turn to Hungary particularly. You talk about the role of constitutional courts in the transition for illiberal governance. Hungary's model, Hungary's history since 2010 have become kind of a major case study for many countries. I remember talking to Professor Yaniv Rosnai, and he was explaining how people in Israel were able to fight at least partially fight the attempt to tame the Supreme Court, because they learned from the lessons in Hungary and Poland. So let me ask you, there's a very symbolic chapter. You say that the courts are the first to go, and this has both a symbolic dimension and a practical dimension. So how does the constitutional courts help the system, and how did it happen in Hungary?
Okay, so very briefly, I would like to summarize the Hungarian story. Not that it is so particular, but perhaps it is a little anecdote to the great story that is noticeable everywhere. So Fidesz, that's the name of the governing party, came to power in 2010, and they had a constituent majority. They had a constituent majority because the then existing constitution had extremely relaxed rules of amending the constitution and amending the law. So simple 2/3 majority was enough, and you got to this without even having the majority. Because of the electoral system. Again, the electoral system was not particularly unworthy. It was a version of the German system. The first thing was court packing. Court packing was made possible because they changed the rules of nomination. Because earlier for nomination, there was a kind of system which granted veto powers to whoever was in minority. So there were new nominations. They increased the number of seats, extended the length of the mandate, and so on and so forth. And therefore, they managed to have a majority in the Constitutional Court. The new appointees and some of the already sitting judges who were sympathetic to the Fidesz, they created a new majority. And even with that new majority, in some instances, this Constitutional Court resisted some of the changes. The government immediately changed the Constitution, limiting the powers of the Constitutional Court. So this is what happened. Now, I don't think that Hungary invented something. Forget about Roosevelt and court packing by Roosevelt. I think if you look at Venezuela, you have not a similar story because the technique was different. It was much more popularly endorsed. The Hungarian thing was a little bit behind the limelight action, not much popular involvement. In Venezuela, that's where you really had a number of reinforcements. And then under the pretext of, and the Supreme Court, of course, gave up. They thought that they can survive, except the president of the court resigned. And of course, they were wrong, because the transition measures of the Venezuela constitutional law, getting rid of them as well as of any other judges. So there and this is technically a very important thing. You have a new constitution, you have a new institutional law, which has transition or transitory rules, and it is within the transitory rules that the dirt occurs. So, if you read the outcome without looking what changes are carried out in order to have the new system is basically not that unusual, unheard of. And what can we do if we have supermajority? We cannot just disregard the desire of the supermajority. So that's not the issue. The issue is that this whole process is used to eliminate the remnants of the inherited constitutional system. Again, it's not a Hungarian or Polish thing. The Poles, by the way, they had difficulties because they didn't have constitutional majority, and it was not, and it was also a happenstance. In Poland, there was an institute, like in Hungary with the Easy Amendment. In Poland, there was a problem because the term of most of the constitutional, it's called Constitutional Tribunal justices, ended at the same time, about a year or two after the takeover by the peace, by the conservative right-wing regime. So these are very often unexpected, unforeseen opportunities rooted in problems of design. In Poland, everybody who was in this thought that there is a problem, but no one acted. In Hungary, the same. It was obvious for experts that the constitutional amendment is the weakest point of the constitution. Nothing happened. The politicians couldn't care less. And then this is what happened. I think beyond the Hungarian story, you had a broader question, but that I forgot because I got into this.
It was just how the courts played the role in the transition to the illiberal regime.
So that's what they did. Once they had the majority, most of the laws were held constitutional. There was also a new constitution which facilitated, because if something is already in the constitution, a constitutional court, what do you expect? Under ordinary circumstances, they will not invent the wheel. There was also a very positivistic tradition in Hungary, goes back to the first constitutional court created after the collapse of communism, that rule of law was understood as legalism. So it was not a matter of value-oriented reinterpretation. It was they expressly, the constitutional doctrine that was accepted in this positivist setting, they expressly refuted the theory of unconstitutional amendment. There was a moment when there was already under the Fidesz constitution, which is called the fundamental law. So there was an amendment to the fundamental law, which was very problematic for the Constitutional Court. But they said, we have a doctrine which excludes, we inherited a doctrine that excludes the doctrine of unconstitutional amendment. Therefore, even if in its substance, this goes against the amendment goes against fundamentals of constitutionalism, we are bound by the Constitution as it is written, not what constitutionalism is. And they gave up on that again. And at the end, there are scholars in the literature who claim that a new function of these captured courts is to promote the government agenda. So it's not that they protect the Constitution, they enforce an anti-constitutionalist interpretation provided by the government or by government actors, and that's their role. So instead of, and of course, from and this is always done in a very technical black letter manner, narrowest interpretation possible.
Grabbing a ride in this last part of your exposition, Professor, turning to the part that gives the book its name, the cheating part. You talk about how these illiberal regimes, they manipulate the application of the rule of law. They do not uphold the rule of law, but they claim to do it. And when I read it, and when I came to one of the Atlantic articles wrote by, I think, Michigan professor Leah Littman, when she talks about how to hide a constitutional crisis, when Donald Trump, for example, got a decision from the US Supreme Court saying that he couldn't expel the Salvadorian migrants without due process. And he just said, oh, but I can't do anything. They're already gone. He thinks he plays like he is upholding, but he does not uphold. And this made me remember of your book right away. So with this example and other examples in mind, how does these mechanisms of cheating with the rule of law work, and why they are so difficult to counter, both legally and politically?
I think the example you quote falls within this cheating by ruling camp, but it's more hypocrisy, it's lip service, okay? So you try to figure out an element of facts to say, yes, but this is something different. This is one ordinary form, happens everywhere, of course. How arrogant you can be, how much you are really arrogant with facts and disregard the general, the rationality of the general public, that's certainly an issue. But the real ruling by cheating is something different. Well, not different, but it's something that entails a different thing, which I think is more interesting. So these regimes, if they have the opportunity to legislate, they legislate the opposite of what would follow from the rule of law. So it's legalistic. They create an opportunity to depart from the law. My favorite example, it comes from Hungary. So there is, under European Union law, a possibility to declare certain investments a matter of national economic interest. If an economic project is declared a matter of national economic interest, then you can dispose of, this is all written into the law, you can dispose of ordinary procedural rules. So you can expedite environmental impact assessment or bypass it. You can disregard the opportunity of a public hearing, and so on and so forth, in the name of being more efficient. And of course, if you disregard all these guarantees of the rule of law, you can imagine what kind of favoritism emerges, what kind of lack of transparency emerges. Another example, public procurement, where, of course, I think this is not something novel to Latin America. That's where the real action goes. That's where real corruption goes. They legalize the corruption. Every procurement of major importance has to go to the clients of the government, family members, or friends of friends. How is that done? You set the procurement conditions in a way that will inevitably result in the in a single favored winner. Everything is legal because the conditions which are determined legally enable that. So this is really ruling by cheating. Cheating becomes, fraud becomes the predominant form of legal regulation. Legal regulation is intended, designed to cheat, to enable the government to prevail in all its activities.
Professor, in a follow-up question, would legal formalism has, in your opinion, any responsibility in this process, or blaming legal formalism is like what people did with legal positivism in the rise of the Third Reich, for example, because people blame the positivists, but there were no respect for positivism in that time. So I ask you, is legal formalism, a scapegoat here, or does it play a major part, or is something in between?
So first of all, thanks for the question, because that enables me to refer to a new book of mine, which is entitled Militant Rule of Law. And in this book, I try to address exactly the problem that you mentioned. What to do with legal formalism? What are the limits? Is the rule of law just pure legality, or is it a little bit more? And of course, I try to argue this on grounds of legal positivism, not because I would quarrel with natural law, but because lawyers today do not listen to natural law arguments, right? So Aquinas or John Finnis have very clear words on, not very clear, but relatively clear indications that there are limits to state power if it is, for example, cheating. But this is irrelevant for the typical legal mindset, because they are trained to follow a kind of legal positivism. The question is legal positivism limited to formalism, to legality? And I think the rule of law is much more, first of all, than you follow the rules as established. There are enormous possibilities in interpretation, so you can really rely on recognized forms of interpretation and exercise considerable resistance. I think examples are always useful, so allow me one. I mentioned procurement, right? Everything is legal because it follows the law. But of course, it's a very well-known maxim or precept of the rule of law, 2,000 plus years, a little bit less, but anyway. So it's a long established tradition that contracts are void if they are unconscionable, if they are going against good morals. Now, if cheating, as you can demonstrate in this case, is de facto cheating, one-sidedness, then this goes against public morals, right? And under the very, very, very traditional contract law, this is void or voidable. And so you can do something about that. So it's not that we are forced to live in a shackle of legality. Lawyers do have alternatives. And I think this is what we should consider here. Instead of assuming that legal positivism, which I respect that because it's a sociological fact today, but legal positivism is not to be limited to legalism. Rule of law contains certain written and unwritten provisions. Let me give another example. Ukraine, not currently, but after the Maidan Revolution, 2014-15, that was a real revolution. They had to get rid of the corrupt judiciary, etc., etc. The European Court of Human Rights ruled that dismissal of judges and high-standing public servants is not necessarily contrary to the rule of law. That the rule of law contains its own exceptions, and I emphasize, rule of law contains its own exceptions. Consider nullum crimen sine lege, right? The no punishment without and no retroactive criminal legislation. Okay? There can be no punishment if there was no crime at the time of the commitment of the act. And then we had to accept, and now it's part of international law and domestic law as well, that certain crimes, genocide in particular, which were not a crime before the Nuremberg trials, were prosecutable. It was extremely problematic because those who prepared the statute of the Nuremberg Court against the Nazis in 1945, the chief criminals or chief leaders of Nazi Germany, they were aware that this is not okay, that it contradicts everything that they were taught in the law school. And that they realized that this is a special situation. And they have to recognize that the original rigid rule did not contemplate an unthinkable situation. But the unthinkable occurred. So you had to react. Emergency exists. This is not, of course, an easy way out from the rule of law to say, oh, emergency, that's really the source of abuse. But if you have clear standards, what are the grounds of reinterpretation, then you can avoid this abuse that is otherwise very much within emergencies and exceptional.
Connected to that, Professor, slightly connected. What we have seen in authoritarian regimes, hybrid regimes, illiberal democracies, is first an attempt to reframe the meaning of democracy. As we have discussed in the beginning, they say that liberal democracy is not the only way. There's the China model of democracy, Russian model of democracy, Hungarian model of democracy. And inside this, one other part that has been more problematic is an attempt to delegitimize another concept, the concept of human rights. Do you believe this is primarily driven by a constitutional reinterpretation, or do you think this is due more to a global trend?
All of that, and I will answer that, but I think I should have started on this when we discussed democracy. So the current problem is not just democracy that doesn't function or became suspicious or abused. The problem is much more the end of what I would call republicanism. Again, you see, I really moved towards Athens and Rome, Republican Rome. What was the problem in Republican Rome? That fundamentally, there was a very strange division of powers and kind of checks and balances. But institutionally, this was not sustainable, and every crisis pushed, and including the broader and broader participation of the public. So moving closer in a way to some kind of popular power. All that pushed all the time towards dictatorship. And of course, this, after several attempts, resulted first in Julius Caesar, and then after his assassination and the Civil War, it resulted in the empire in Octavianus. So, and that was then perpetuated. It was not, this is Mary Bird who said that, it is not the emperor who created the empire, but the empire that created the emperor. And this is the contemporary problem. So democracy is certainly part of this, but what we are really concerned is the end of separation of powers and the concentration of power, either oligarchy or most likely imperial presidentialism, etc., etc. Now, you asked me about human rights, which has to be understood in this context, because human rights were one of the modern forms of, if you wish, functionally separation of powers. It was a way of, just like rule of law, curtailing the efforts to concentrate power. That the traditional understanding of human rights as fundamental constitutional rights was always to limit the power of the government. And this original plan, of course, became embedded in human dignity and so on and so forth. But then from that point on, it became an idea that became richer and richer. And it's resulted in, it was a very successful project. People love to call it project for some reason. But it was efficient, successful. It was a irresistible battle cry. It was also a source of international influencing, etc. So it was important. It is important. But it resulted, success generated its own consequences. There was a rights inflation. Rights were pitted against other rights. Some of these conflicts are hard to resolve. Abortion is one of those. There are many others. And there were also many which were artificially created, especially in the United States. So the human rights system became extremely complex. The more complex it became, the less manageable it was. Rights used to be trumps, in plural, okay, not Trump.
Yeah, Ronald Dworkin.
Yeah. And that's not functioning anymore. So you just pick the one that serves your purpose. That's point number one. Point number two, we haven't discussed much the international setting except this dependence earlier. There are a number of countries where human rights seem not to be crucial for the population, either because too much oppression takes this out from the mentality. There is no tradition of individualism. That's very important for human rights. There's no tradition for liberty, which is very difficult to develop. And these regimes can be very successful. The real successful illiberal democracy is, of course, Singapore. I think I don't think that there is a firm commitment to traditional first generation human rights in Singapore. People seem to be happy with the liberal regime because of the efficiency of the regime. So democracy and human rights were attractive and influential because they delivered other goods. In communist countries, most people wanted liberal democracy because they had the impression that the normal life, the normal society, where there is a consumer's heaven. So in 88, 89 in Hungary, liberalization meant that everybody can go to Austria and buy a refrigerator. So you have incredible pictures. Trabant was this very low quality East German car, small car, very huge emission of all things that are not good. And you see caravans of cars coming back from the West when the borders were open, and on the roof, you see the fridge or deep freezer or what's not. But that was the attractiveness. And of course, the welfare in the West had to do with recognition of human rights. But there are huge parts of the world where this doesn't matter. And of course, China brought out hundreds of millions of people from poverty, which is a major requirement or demand of modern human rights. So what can you say about the oppression in China? Their performance is what matters, both for Chinese and for many other people who depend on China or what's not. And finally, because of the interdependence, we discussed this in the context of illiberal democracies, the international interest, the pressure for human rights is diminishing because of the interdependence, because you need friendship, contact, support of non-democratic states.
Professor, turning to what was once your practice, how should international and legal institutions and supranational courts, for example, adapt to confront this strategy for mimicking the legality of liberal states? Because there's that traditional naming and shaming, that's most of it. But is there something else that can be done by these supranational institutions to fight this process in constitutional states?
I have to speak of two minds. So in terms of moral obligation, they should go as far as they can with existing techniques of interpretation, use their imagination, do everything within the four corners of the law to resist. That's the normative András Sájo was speaking, but I started as a sociologist of law, and that requires some realism. And then you come to realize that judges are not made, they're not born and not socialized to be moral heroes. There are doctrines of complacency embellished into judicial deferentialism. There is a trend in international courts which says that what matters is the survival of the institution, and that requires some compromises. And if you look at the case law of some courts, they are reluctant to resist the changes, or let me put it this way, sometimes they are very reluctant to see the change. And if you don't see the change, if you don't see the threat and the danger, then it's very easy not to respond. And that's, I think, happens in some instances. It's not a general trend. The European Court of Justice, in the context of the Polish judicial problems, was very active and invented new doctrines to catch the illiberal tendency or the violation of judicial independence. But then in other instances, you don't see the same desire, a willingness to respond. So that's a fact. It has to do with the nature of international organizations. They depend of states because of the budget, personnel. You know, there is this famous oft-quoted line that Stalin is informed that the Pope in Rome dislikes whatever he does. And then Stalin says, okay, and how many divisions of tank has the Pope? So that's so in a way, the international courts are a little bit in the position and not having the same prestige, I must say.
Professor, to my last question, you talked briefly about your newest book that will come out, I think, in later 2025. So I would like to extend you the invitation to give us some spoilers about the major ideas of this new militant rule of law book.
Well, spoiler. I think I mentioned already that it is a call to arms, but a call to arms where the arms are, within. If this were a sports like I don't know, fencing. There are rules in fencing there, and you can't use certain daggers in fencing. So the idea is to use the proper authorized tools in fencing in the defense of militant democracy. It also has, to me, interesting. I learned a lot writing this history of exceptionalism and also theory. So it's both a practical book in the sense of providing arguments for resisting this kind of ruling by cheating, rule of law, backsliding, and particularly also how to restore a system after the rule of law was seriously wounded. But it's also a kind of summary of what are the limits of the social and political limits. And it's quite interesting to see that whatever theoretical considerations one has, the reality sets very serious limits. The spoiler, here comes the spoiler. Don't give up hope, notwithstanding all this. That's the most important. The imagination becomes paralyzed if you just look at what happens generally. There are exceptions, but the exceptions operate, exceptions to this complacency. This operates only if imagination is kept intact, constitutional imagination. That's the most important thing, what morally a lawyer or someone committed to constitutionalists can do. So that's basically the spoiler. Don't give up.
Perfect, Professor. Thank you very much for your time, for the insightful lessons. I hope everything here is as enriching for our listeners as it was for me. Your book was cited by me twice in my paper that will come out in the Vermont Law Journal. And again, even for aesthetic purposes, it is a beautiful cover. It is a beautiful book to have you on your bookshelf.
Yes, I fully agree. It's a beautiful cover, but that's not me, that's my wife. It was her idea.
Very good, very good. Professor, thank you. And I hope we can talk again when the next book come out, because the topic is trending on Brazil for the last at least 4 or 5 years.
I can imagine. Okay, so looking forward. Take care.